O cosmic birther of all radiance and vibration, soften the ground of our being and carve out a space within us where your presence can abide. Fill us with your creativity so that we may be empowered to bear the fruit of your mission. Let each of our actions bear fruit in accordance with our desire. Endow us with the wisdom to produce and share what each being needs to grow and flourish. Untie the tangled threads of destiny that bind us as we release others from the entanglement of past mistakes. Do not let us be seduced by that which would divert us from our true purpose, but illuminate the opportunities of the present moment. For you are the ground and the fruitful vision, the birth, power, and fulfillment, as all is gathered and made whole once again. And so it is. Now I'll hand over to Penelope and John.
Well, thank you very much, Sue.
And Mary as well.
Thank you, Sue, for putting us in the right context. It's my very great honour to be here to introduce Penelope Middlebow and Dr. John Rosebank. I realised that I only met Penelope 6 years ago, this month. It feels like I've known her for half a lifetime. Lucky me. With her, a few of us started up our fledgling root and branch in 2020. We began holding our monthly talks, events, prayer sessions and newsletters. And rather to our amazement, we put together and held 3 live and online synods. Not Pope Francis's synods, but root and branch. Bristol 2021, Spirit Unbounded in Rome and Bristol 2023, and then Hinsley Hall in 2024. Penelope was a driving force behind the International Coalition for Reform, Spirit Unbounded. Together, she and John made over 110 videos highlighting human rights, or the lack of them, in the Catholic Church across the world. And I do urge you to head to the Spirit Unbounded website at some point and dive into this treasure trove of videos. All of this powerful activity is driven by Penelope's search for justice and her passion to build a safe, a just and an inclusive environment, with particular reference to the Catholic Church from which so many of us come. Penelope is a writer, historian, film series editor, and a former CEO of the large UK charity, the Shakespeare Schools Foundation. She now produces the History Cafe with John. She has deliberately stepped back a little to enjoy her grandchildren, but I suspect only a little. I got to know John through Penelope. I can't tell you how inspiring it was in 2021, which were COVID times, if you remember, to have a BBC and Channel 4 producer amongst us as we tackled the incredibly challenging logistics of turning a live, in-person gathering in Bristol into a simultaneous worldwide live event on this interesting new technology called Zoom. The standard advice of the experts on this sort of hybrid event was, don't. But we did. John's professional input was an education in itself. Again, you can find all the videos from our synods on our Root and Branch website. Do enjoy them, please. John took the top first in modern history in his year at Oxford, and he was snapped up Don's life of research and teaching, first by the BBC and then by Channel 4. He wrote, directed and produced many series telling history stories from Neolithic archaeology to trawling on the North Sea. He has authored impressive tomes, and his latest foray into print is a novel, A Spring Marrying, which is a compelling account of the extraordinary history of the sail trawlers and trawlermen working off the English coast in the early 20th century. All of this, and at the same time, John and Penelope now together produce the History Cafe podcast, and I believe we'll find out a little more about that later.
She's gone mute.
Apostolic succession is the Church's justification for its authority, and its belief that discernment is the unique charism and province of bishops, not of us, the Church, but of bishops. This talk will demonstrate, I believe, that we don't have to accept the Church's refusal of women priests or similar issues. It will show that they have simply invented the apostolic succession, so that they can make the Church in the 4th century image they have chosen: male, imperial, misogynistic, undemocratic. John and Penelope, thank you so much for all the trouble you've been to get this far, and we welcome you here to tell us why there's nothing apostolic about the Catholic Church. Over to you.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Mary, so much. It's I suppose we should add that this is just a sketch that comes from a much longer series on History Cafe. It's a 6-part series. We're halfway through it in broadcasting. So if this sounds a bit sketchy to you, that's because it's a sketch. And what we're having to do is to summarize here in 40 minutes or so what is in fact, 3 hours, something like more than 3 hours of material. So anyway, I think Mary's already put the question here. It's always good to start with a question when we get together like this. What authority does the Catholic Church have? It's a question that affects us all, from can we have communion in both kinds again, please, in our parish church, to, can we have women priests? The answer is always the same. We'll let you know. It's not up to you. We don't really want to hear what you have to say. We'll let you know. We apparently can't decide. They can. And anybody who's tried to communicate with the Vatican, anybody who's tried to communicate with the Catholic hierarchy, as indeed Root and Branch did over and over again during the synodal process, always has the same response. There is no response. We don't even get an acknowledgement. They certainly don't reply. The question is, what authority does the clerical Catholic Church have to behave like this towards the laity?
Perhaps it's worth starting by looking at what Jesus said when the Jerusalem chief priests and elders challenged him to prove his authority. He asked them a question back. John's baptism, did it come from heaven or was it of human origin? The chief priests and elders cannot reply. Jesus isn't being evasive. What he's saying is that the kingdom of God isn't about authority. It's about the Spirit. He's asking them, was God's Spirit at work in John or not? And they refuse to answer the question because an unbounded spirit would be a threat to their own status and power.
Now, when you look at the church in the Gospels and in the Acts of the Apostles, that was written before the Gospels, you can see that it has very little hierarchy. In fact, the joke is that Peter, whom Jesus calls the rock, is a man who plainly cannot lead. Throughout the Gospels and into the Acts, Peter gets it wrong every time. Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ, and then immediately he says, you can't go up to Jerusalem and suffer at the hands of the people there. And Jesus has to tell him off and say, Satan, get behind me. He denies Jesus, as we know. He gets it wrong every single time. And the interesting thing is that the early church knew that, and they recorded it. The implication must be that Jesus did not intend to establish a hierarchic and authoritarian church, and the early church knew that. So the question is, how on earth do we end up with one?
Let's look at Paul. When he travels to the churches in Antioch, Corinth, and elsewhere, he meets with the elders. Now, elders were an accepted Jewish way of running a congregation. Paul also mentions other leaders whom he calls overseers, but he firmly denounces hierarchy. We all know he said there's to be no slave or free, no man or woman, no Jew or Greek. All are equal and all take their part as the Spirit leads them. In fact, for a while, they give all their possessions away and live in collective poverty because they think Jesus is coming back soon.
Now, we think the church did not acquire its hierarchy and its extravagant claims to authority until, in fact, the 4th century. Now, I suppose before we go on, it's important to say that both Penelope and I are modern historians, which means that the Roman Empire is to us a completely foreign world. This, what you're getting now, is really our first impressions. But it has to be said that over the last couple of generations, more and more historians trained in the techniques of modern history have been examining and re-examining the Roman Empire. And the result has been a complete transformation, fresh thinking on the Roman Empire and fresh thinking on the questions of the early church. So no apologies really for being modern historians having a first look at those early centuries of the church. Now, the 4th century church was quite unlike the church of the first disciples. This was a church of hierarchy, status, and authority. And you see, this turns out to have nothing at all to do with theology. This was a matter of history, and that in 2 senses. First of all, the history that the church claims to have happened, and then in the second place, the history that actually did happen. And we're going to look at those 2 things, one after the other. Let's look first of all at the history that the church claims to have happened between the 1st century, Jesus' time, and the 4th century. Now, the church says that it operates in direct historical physical succession from Peter as the first bishop of Rome, and more generally in direct succession from the other apostles. The point is that if you're not ordained in this physical succession, you are not ordained. But if you are ordained, especially as a bishop, then you, and only you, are invested with the authority that Jesus gave to Peter and the other apostles. And the rest of us can just shut up. Now, the first question is, was Peter the first bishop of Rome? Well, for centuries, going back at least to the early 16th century, anyone who has examined the evidence has concluded that Peter cannot possibly have gone to Rome and become its bishop. It's simply historically untenable.
Let's look at the Acts of the Apostles. They chart Peter's movements in detail up to the early AD 50s. Peter is, as Paul confirms, given responsibility for the mission to the Jews along with his wife. So he's based in Jerusalem, though significantly, he's not in charge there. It's worth, the person who is in charge is one of Jesus' brothers, James, who we never hear about, except it's in the Acts of the Apostles. It's worth pointing out that the Cambridge theologian Simon Gathercole has shown that the first Christians believed that Jesus would return in their lifetimes, and that he would return, obviously, to Jerusalem. So the chances that Peter would leave the city for any length of time are slim. In AD 56, this is interesting, Paul goes back to Jerusalem and he meets, he says, the elders. Now, on previous visits, he has stayed in Peter's house. But this time, Paul ominously says nothing at all about Peter.
Aha, you see, that's because Peter must have gone to Rome. But you see, the Acts of the Apostles goes on recording events for years and years after this. And yet, after chapter 15, it says not a word about Peter. He simply vanishes. Not that, incidentally, if you went to Sunday Mass, you'd ever know, since the Sunday lectionary never includes anything from Acts after chapter 15. Fact is that there's simply no credible historical record anywhere, certainly not in the 1st century, that records Peter going to or being in or even anywhere near Rome.
But haven't we all heard about Peter being crucified upside down by Nero in AD 64?
Mm-hmm.
During one of Nero's persecutions of the Christians? Well, this story first appears about a century later, and we can say is plainly an invention. Now, we can be certain it's an invention because there were so few Christians in Rome in the AD 60s that nobody bothered with them. In fact, the authorities didn't distinguish Christians from Jews until at least AD 100, let alone persecute them. The only evidence for Nero's persecution of Christians comes from an 11th century copy of now vanished edition of an equally lost 5th century version of a long disappeared 2nd century book written by a Roman writer called Tacitus. And throughout his writing, Tacitus finds any excuse to criticize Nero. So there really is no need for us to believe him.
Well, the obvious conclusion, in fact, is, for all the historical evidence we have, that Peter had died in his bed in Jerusalem somewhere around AD 55. And incidentally, the early church was so uninterested in him by then, it didn't even bother to mention it. But you will say, didn't they find St. Peter's body under St. Peter's Basilica in Rome? Well, now.
Well, you can get the whole story in our podcast, episode 1, Whatever Happened to St. Peter? And it tells you plenty about the Catholic Church's attitude towards real history. But in brief, in 1940, Pius XII commissioned an excavation under the Basilica of St. Peter's. Why? Because Mussolini was digging up Rome looking for pagan sites to boost his authority. And the Pope needed something Christian to put the dictator in his place. How about the tomb of St. Peter? So Pius XII found a couple of Jesuits with a bit of archaeological training, and he set them to work.
The digging was in fact done by the Basilica's maintenance team, and they were led along by Monsignor Ludwig Kaas, who had been in fact the key figure in handing Hitler the legislation that made him a dictator in the Reichstag of 1933. You really couldn't make this stuff up, could you? Anyway, every night after everyone else had gone home, Monsignor Kaas would take one of the workmen underground to do some more smashing around and remove any bones he could find. They put human bones, yes, well, whatever bones they could find. They put them in a wooden box in the maintenance store. Meanwhile, during the day, one of those Jesuits would pocket anything he thought looked interesting and take it back to his lodgings with him.
Well, they found plenty of pagan tombs. The only bones anyone found,
well, during the daytime anyway,
belonged to an elderly woman, 2 younger men, and some animals. They're looking for Peter, remember. So Pius XII decided to draw a line under all this and say nothing. But then 8 years later, someone leaked the story of the excavations to the press. So Pius went on the radio at Christmas 1950 and announced they had found the tomb of St. Peter.
What? Anyway, in 1952, they got in a woman to knock some heads together. Professor Margherita Guarducci was appalled by the mess she discovered. But, well, Professor Guarducci was nothing if not a pious Catholic, and she promptly announced that some rough scratches on a bit of wall that the Jesuit had taken home with him, they were the first. Well, if you close your eyes and you kind of use your imagination, they looked like they might be the first letters of, well, Peter, and maybe also was here in Greek, of course. So that, of course, proves that it must be the tomb of Peter.
You can see it. You can see it on our website, the photograph. I mean, the piece.
There was then, silence for 16 years. And then Pope Paul VI dramatically announced that they'd taken a closer look at those random bones that had been stuffed in a box in the maintenance store. Now, he said, they had the strongest proof, quotes, the strongest proof that they were the bones of St. Peter. Well, you don't need me to tell you that he can't possibly have known. The graffiti on the lump of wall proves nothing at all. Isotopic analysis of skeletal remains, which can at least establish where an individual had lived in the course of their life, wasn't invented until after 1968. It was invented in the 1970s and didn't really come into its own until much more recently. John Paul II and Benedict clearly decided that these were not Peter's bones. Perhaps they secretly tested them, who knows. Anyway, they put them back in the story. In 2013, Francis got them out again, kissed the box, and announced that once again they were the bones of St. Peter. You have to say that this is just a farce. One of the things we forget about the church is just how utterly incompetent it can be.
But for the historian, the more interesting question is where this myth of Peter in Rome came from in the first place. The story was certainly around 50 or 60 years after Peter's death, which makes us think it may have something to do with the fall of Jerusalem, which you remember is in AD 70. Now, as we know from the Acts of the Apostles, I've got to go and read it properly, the early church was centered in Jerusalem, where it was run not by Peter, but by Jesus's family, something else which is never mentioned by the church. But in AD 66, the Romans invaded Palestine and moved steadily south, laying waste to everything as they went and kicking the Jews out.
Which is a sadly recognizable story today, I'm afraid.
In AD 70, the Romans reached Jerusalem and destroyed it. The Christians there probably fled south. They couldn't go north, and they ended up in Egypt, leaving
Peter's grave behind, almost certainly,
in Jerusalem. Alexandria became the leading Christian center with its own pope or patriarch.
But you see, Rome was still the center of the empire at that time and would be for another 50 or 100 years. The early Christians in Rome, many of them were Greek-speaking and Jewish, had always, of course, identified with Paul. There's very decent evidence that Paul had, in fact, gone to Rome. He would almost certainly have been executed there. But after the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, it seems the historical evidence is that the wealthier, Latin-speaking, perhaps non-Jewish Christians in Rome began to cook up a different story. Peter, you see, was the boss, the guy like them in charge. Surely, like them, the wealthy Romans, he must have been an intellectual, a philosopher, not an illiterate fisherman.
To these wealthier Roman Christians, Peter, the boss, was far preferable to Paul, who'd been executed as a criminal. I mean, that was actually why he'd gone to Rome to plead his case. So let's just say that now that Jerusalem's been destroyed as the center, Peter must have come to Rome. Now stories begin to grow up about the extravagant miracles that Peter performed in Rome and various rival sites for his burial.
But you see, to say that Peter was ever the bishop of Rome is historically unsustainable. Even if you ignore the evidence in Acts, the point is there were no bishops in Rome, as we understand them, until hundreds of years after Peter's death. So look, let's put Peter aside. The church shores up its authority in a second way, the apostolic succession, the idea that the bishops run in a line from the apostles. Well, let's just think about the apostles for a moment. The New Testament preserved virtually no memory of them. Look, check it out. They can't even in the Gospels agree on what the names of the apostles are, and they disappear almost immediately after the ascension. There may in fact have been, never in fact have been, 12 apostles. The Hebrew scholar Alfred Osborne tells me that it was probably just a number chosen after the fall of Jerusalem to represent the 12 tribes of Israel. It was meant to make the point that the church was now the new Israel.
That's fairly scary, isn't it, to think of, if that's true. By the 4th century, all anyone could tell you was where just three of the apostles had gone: John, Andrew, and Thomas. And Thomas had gone to Iran, not Kerala, sadly. But nobody knew anything at all about what had happened to them after they got there. It becomes obvious that nobody in the early church had been trying to claim any continuity with the apostles, so they hadn't worried about it.
They simply stopped keeping records of them. So what is all this concept of an apostolic succession? Ordained bishops, priests, and deacons lining up in a physical succession, one after the other, right from the time of the first apostles. Well, the official story is, and Catholic theologians, traditionalists will tell you, that this can all be seen in the early Christian writers of the so-called church fathers. The church used even to say that there are apostles, bishops, priests, and deacons in Paul's letters to Timothy and Titus. Problem is, you see, it turns out that this is just a schoolboy error in translation. In fact, it's a whole series of errors in translation. Apostle, ordain, bishop, priest, deacon, succession, even the word for church, not one of these words originally meant what the church now tells us it meant.
For example, Tom O'Loughlin, who's often been to Root and Branch events, has shown that the word apostle didn't originally mean one of Jesus's 12 chosen disciples. It meant an itinerant preacher. And by the 2nd century, apostles were fetching up out of nowhere and expecting board and lodging in return for a dodgy sermon. I mean, this is Tom O'Loughlin, professor of historical theology. Well, nobody would want to trace their ordination back to these characters. But anyway, ordination itself, the word ordination also meant something completely different in the Roman Empire. It had no religious content at all. You were ordained into any job, into a job in the civil service. It just meant being appointed to something. So we've got a few slides.
Okay, so we have an inscription here we can show you. So let's see if we can see it. Here we go. So here's the first inscription. Are you able to see that? There we are. So these are some of the words that that were being used in the early writings of the church fathers, but they just simply don't mean what we think they do. Ordinare, that's a Latin word. It doesn't mean to be ordained, hands laid on, or anything. It simply means to be appointed to any old job at all. What about the word that became the word for bishop, episkopos? As Mary Varley says, she is an episkopos. Now, what does it mean? It actually comes from two Greek bits, Epi meaning over and skopos meaning see, an overseer. And the point about an episkopos was that all kinds of people in the early years of the Roman Empire had an episkopos. If you had a sports club, you had an episkopos. If you had a house, you had an episkopos. He was the guy who simply ran your accounts. If you had a farm, you had an episkopos. He was your steward. He simply looked after the farm. It was a very common word in the Roman Empire, and it simply means overseer. Now, an episkopos might be accompanied and helped by a diakonos. Now, a diakonos wasn't a deacon. A diakonos is simply a clerk, some kind of administrator, often somebody who helps the episkopos with his... we seem to have gone to a different slide here. He simply helps the episkopos with his finances. As you see, in fact, from the Acts of the Apostles, the early deacons were appointed to help distribute the money to the widows. It was a financial appointment, had nothing to do with being part of a kind of ordained clergy. In fact, if you just jump behind kleros, the word we now use for clergy, just meant somebody assigned to a job, often by lot. It didn't mean somebody who'd been ordained in some sort of mystical way. And laos, the word we use for laity, simply means everybody else. What about presbyteroi, elders? They're often translated as priests. Well, in the original Greek, it didn't mean priests at all. It meant elders, which was simply a system of government that the early church had carried over from the Jewish synagogues. So all of these words simply meant something quite different than the church tries to claim they meant. Even ecclesia, and we'll come back to that later on, didn't mean church. It simply meant an assembly. If you met as a town council, that was an ecclesia. If you met as a trade group, a trade association under your episkopos who was running your trade association, that was an ecclesia. Ecclesia simply meant a meeting. It didn't mean a church. So let's see if we can just come out of sharing. Here we go, stop sharing there. The point is, therefore, that if the church fathers write about bishop, priests, and deacons, they're not talking about a mystic order of ordained clergy. What they're talking about are the local worthies who just ran things, like the church wardens of your parish church, or the trustees and stewards of your Methodist chapel, or your Baptist chapel down the road. In fact, the new ESV, in a very rare moment of honest translation, actually translates episkopos in the letters of St. Paul not as bishop, as the Jerusalem Bible used to, but as overseer. The point is, these words don't mean some kind of mystic clergy. They simply mean a bunch of people who are just helping out if they can.
Now, succession, as in apostolic succession, is another slippery word. It was a word that was used to give the pedigree of a family or a school of philosophy. So wealthy Roman citizens traced their pedigree back to the gods like Apollo or Jupiter. That was their succession. Nobody seriously believed them. Jewish families did the same. Tom O'Loughlin talks about this. But check Matthew and Luke. They've got genealogies of Jesus. Matthew's goes back to Abraham and Luke's to Adam. Well, the Catholic Church doesn't believe these are historical. This kind of genealogy was used to show kind of where you belonged or to boost your authority. Now, the earliest surviving history of the church, the earliest surviving one, was written by a bishop called Eusebius of Caesarea, early in the 4th century. And he says that his purpose is establishing the successions, note the plural, of the apostles. But he's not saying anything about the idea of a line of physical ordinations from the apostles until now. His successions simply mean a school of thought, a semi-fictional pedigree.
So, for example, Eusebius gives a list of bishops of Rome. It was, we know, originally drawn up to win an argument with the Gnostics, a school of philosophy. It begins, of course, with Peter. Well, that tells you all you need to know. And then includes Linus, who was who's a mate of Paul's, who was mentioned only once in 2 Timothy. And then Cletus, who's never mentioned anywhere else in any other document at all. Linus, Cletus, you may recognize these names. Now, it's obvious that this list of bishops of Rome is simply a semi-fictional pedigree like any other from the time. It's not intended to be history. Half the time, in fact, Eusebius doesn't even use the word episkopos for these characters. He calls them other things, and he tells us that they were often just chosen by their congregations and indeed just ordained by the other bishops around them, just chosen and consecrated by the other clergy around them. In fact, we know that in certain regions, like, for example, North Africa, every single church had its own episkopos. These are simply not bishops as we now know them. As soon as you look more closely, the whole idea of an apostolic succession from the first apostles through the bishops to now crumbles to dust. It's the combined mistranslation of two words. Apostolic successions originally meant something like a pedigree of preaching, keeping alive the message of the Gospels. It was never meant to mean some mystic authority granted to the few over the many. What we're discovering here is that you just can't read these early sources, the church fathers, as if they were some column in yesterday's newspaper or a novel published last summer. It's not just a problem of mistranslation. Now, a friend of mine who's now a distinguished late Roman professor who trained with me as a modern historian switched for his doctorate to late Roman history. And he told me that he was absolutely shocked by what he discovered. Didn't the classicists realize, he said, that all these documents that they were reading were in fact rewritten much later, after the Roman Empire, in the 8th and 9th centuries? They're not at all what they appear. You see, he's right. The fact is, and it's a pretty shocking fact, that we have literally not a single surviving original manuscript from the ancient world. Plato, Aristotle, Tertullian, Cyprian, Ignatius, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, or anybody else. All we have are later copies and translations of copies of edited versions of translations of copies. In fact, we have hardly anything at all from before the 8th and 9th centuries. And this is absolutely crucial.
Yes, you see, by the 580s AD, monks were complaining that they just couldn't read any of the old texts. So what were they doing? They were using them to light fires. Church councils never referred to these old books anyway, because they couldn't read them. And by the AD 740s, the church councils were openly saying that they knew of no documentary continuity with the past. But then, hallelujah, from the 750s, the monks began trying to read the manuscripts again, the ones they hadn't burned. But sadly, this isn't good news for historians. You see, they were looking for something in particular and jettisoning everything else. It was very dangerous.
Actually, you might want to take a later parallel. Around 1530, Henry VIII sent his scholars off to look for old documents to prove that kings of England has historically always been head of the church there. And surprise, surprise, of course, they found them. They put them together under the title that we might paraphrase as the really convincing collection. It didn't matter that many were forgeries or ripped out of context. Henry VIII had got what he wanted. Well, the thing is that exactly the same process had occurred in the 8th century. The Merovingians and then the Carolingian kings needed to justify the authority of their newly proclaimed Holy Roman Empire. On Christmas Day, AD 800, Charles the Great, Charlemagne, had himself crowned by Pope Leo III. It was a symbolic moment, the seal on their new joint authority of church and state over Europe. So that's why the monks had been sent scurrying back to their libraries. The historian Michael Edward Moore says that the intention was, quotes, to reimagine Christian antiquity as a time of sacred origins, when the ancient fathers wrote with perfect clarity and authority.
Say that again, because that's just so scary.
The idea was to reimagine Christian antiquity as a time of sacred origins, when the ancient fathers wrote with perfect clarity and authority. So, of course, the only documents that they found, in other words, allowed to survive, were the ones that backed up the authoritarian politics of church and state. That's all we have today.
One guess is that 5/6 of the documents that had made it to AD 750, and there weren't that many, subsequently disappeared. So don't imagine for a moment that the work of any author who defended the spirit-filled egalitarianism of the first church survived. No wonder we can't find anything. And since then, the church has gone on sifting and selecting and misplacing and accidentally on purpose losing. And nowadays, withholding documents or reports from commissions on women deacons or whatever that don't suit its authoritarian image.
So you see, if our bishops quote from the so-called late Roman church fathers to us, like Cyprian, who was a favourite during the so-called synodal process, we are really entitled to a wry grin. We should never forget that these church fathers were the voices of a tiny minority writing in their own bubble. Historian Keith Hopkins reckons that it wasn't until about AD 200 that there would even have been one literate Christian for each congregation broadly. And then we have to factor in the regular mass destruction or rewriting of documents, particularly under Charlemagne's political autocracy and ever since. Not to mention the absolutely deliberate forgery of other documents, which we know about, the problem of mistranslation. Just take a favourite quote of the bishops. It's supposed to come from St. Ignatius of Antioch. You will know it very well. Where the bishop is, there is the church. Okay, if you take the original meanings of those words, where the bishop is, there is the church, it might just as well be translated, it's a good idea to hold your meetings at the house of your accountant, because that's what the original words meant. Besides, historian Marcus Vincent has said that we have really no idea how many of the letters Ignatius is supposed to have written he actually did. And even if you could work it out, he says, there are simply too many variations in the text to have any idea at all what Ignatius originally wrote. Certainly nothing he wrote would have survived if it disagreed with the authority of the church. The point is that nobody should be using any of this church fathers stuff in present day church affairs. None of it, what it seems. It's a bit like quoting Aristotle in a Bank of England interest rate committee. Quaint, but now let's get on with the real business. So look, let's now leave behind the history the church claimed to have happened, its succession from Peter and its succession from the apostles, which turned out just to be an embarrassing muddle of myth and mistranslation. Let's look at the history that actually does seem to have happened. Enter the Emperor Constantine.
Well, before that, let's sketch a little bit of the background. Up to about AD 200, the church seems to have been tiny, less than 1% of the population. But it does seem to have begun to grow in the 3rd century, and particularly in the second half of the 3rd century. Now, traditionalists like to imagine that the church responds exclusively to God's prompting and is immune to what's happening in the rest of society. It's nonsense, and there couldn't be a clearer example than the origins of the church we now have in what is now known as the 3rd century crisis. So the 3rd century crisis is what created or allowed this church that we now have to emerge. You see, the Roman Empire had benefited from centuries of unusually mild weather. But from about AD 200, and especially from the AD 240s, the weather broke. There was a terrible drought even in Egypt, where the annual flooding of the Nile failed to happen. Then there was a prolonged and deadly epidemic, something like Ebola. There were invasions by desperate peoples all round the borders. Sound familiar? The Roman coinage collapsed and inflation reached 1,000%. The empire very nearly imploded.
So now imperial administration becomes much tougher, much more centralized, simplifying a very complex process. In the towns where most of the churches met, usually in people's houses, society begins to change. The richer move out into the country estates. Skilled artisans, shopkeepers, small-time professionals start to take over local government. They have the time and the money, and they do it out of a sense of duty. By the later 3rd century, so towards AD 300, these local grandees are also beginning to take over the church. At a local level, church government is effectively merging into local government.
And one sign of this change is that the church leaders begin to be paid. Another sign was that women dropped out of church leadership. As you all know, there are plenty of women leaders in the New Testament. Junia, Chloe, well, I won't go into that now, but by the end of the 3rd century, there are no women in church leadership, except presumably in small house churches. And the reason was that there are no women professionals in imperial or local government. And they were both the same now.
The church's theology, of course, should have led it to continue St. Paul's injunctions to treat everyone equally. But no, the church simply merged with the rest of Roman society. It, of course, later would cod up some theology to try and justify why women had to be excluded. Don't really want to talk much more about women because that's something that you talk about a lot and other people are better qualified to talk about it. But it's an interesting example of what was happening in the 3rd century. The church was merging with Roman society. And this was the situation by AD 303, when the Emperor Diocletian launched what was the most vicious persecution of the Christians the ancient world ever saw. Now, the notion that Christians were always being thrown to the lions is simply another later myth. Except for a few isolated local cases, nobody could really care less about Christians before about AD 250, when there was a limited empire-wide crackdown. Probably actually a response to the climate crisis. Somebody had to take the blame, but it had then been mercifully brief.
Diocletian's persecution was much more serious. It lasted for 11 years, but it was a failure. The church was now just too embedded in local society to be stamped out. Non-Christians were now protecting their Christian neighbors. So in AD 311, Diocletian's successor ended the terror for good and announced toleration. Well, we call him his successor, but in fact, Diocletian had abdicated in favor of 4 emperors ruling jointly. Constantine was not one of these 4. He was a young, successful military commander, and he now set off to eliminate the 4 emperors one by one and make himself emperor. In AD 312, the story goes, besieging what by then was a half-empty backwater called Rome.
Rome, yeah. Who remembered Rome?
Because Alexandria is the center. He claimed to have a dream in which Jesus told him to fight under Jesus's banner. Constantine supposedly converted and within 12 years made himself sole emperor. He then, we're told, proclaimed Christianity the religion of the empire.
But of course, none of this story is true. For a start, because Constantine never converted to Christianity, except perhaps on his deathbed. Look, go to his triumphal arch opposite the Colosseum. It's still there. Have a look. It has no Christian symbolism at all, nor have the various coins and medals that Constantine minted. Anyway, Constantine didn't come up with this story about a dream until decades later. What Constantine did was to negotiate a political alliance between anyone who was in favor of moderation and toleration. In his words, those, quotes, exhibiting a calm and conciliatory temper. As a usurper, you see, Constantine needed all the supporters he could get, including the church.
And with the climate crisis, he also wanted the church's unique system of poor relief. Really good thing that the church was doing. And he had the idea of using the church leaders, whom he rather optimistically called sacrosanct men, as an independent system of appeal tribunals that he didn't need to pay. But in order to boost his new supporters, I mean, he wasn't short of money, he gave the church various tax privileges and monopolies. None of this was theology. It was politics.
Well, Constantine quickly discovered he created a monster. Pocketing his imperial money, the church leaders turned out not to be sacrosanct men at all. They were, frankly, a bunch of worldly gangsters. Within a few decades, the church was transformed. By the AD 430s, Saint Cyril, Pope of Alexandria, was handing out 1/2 a ton of gold in bribes to the city powerful, as well as houses and orchards and retinues of slaves to his gang members. By the 6th century, the patriarchs of Alexandria were building fleets of ships to trade across the Mediterranean. Something truly terrible had happened to the church. Church councils repeatedly passed decrees against episcopal greed, also incidentally banning women from sharing bishops' bedrooms. The fact that they kept on passing the decrees made it obvious they were all being ignored. Now, you'll perhaps have to listen to our podcast to get the true extent of these gangsters' behaviour. But let's just say the first fist fights broke out in the streets of Alexandria between the aging and incompetent bishop, or Pope of Alexander, and one of the world's most distinguished theologians, a man called Arius. This was in the mid-320s. I don't believe the nonsense the church tells you about Arius. You can read James Cook Webster's rather illuminating piece in the Tablet on the 16th of August this year. As he shows, at least a third of the church shared Arius's belief. We don't actually exactly know what Arius's views were, since all of his writings have, of course, been suppressed. And anyway, in reality, this struggle that was going on in the streets of Alexandria in the 320s was probably a fight over who would be the next Pope of Alexandria.
Anyway, with violence threatening his carefully constructed political centrist alliance, Constantine summons the church leaders to a council at Nicaea. We've heard of all that. It's a long story, but finally Constantine's man demands that the assembled bishops sign an agreed statement or be exiled. It's what we nowadays recite in a slightly modified form as the Nicene Creed. But this wasn't about theology. You see, no ancient religion, with possible exception of Judaism, had a list of statements you had to agree to. For Jesus, the faith was love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Nicaea was politics. The compromise document was meant to end the faction fighting and re-establish Constantine's political alliance.
The problem was it changed the church forever. Now being a Christian wasn't a matter of loving in a Christ-like way or listening to the promptings of the Spirit. Now being a member of Christ's body meant signing up to a party political manifesto of beliefs. It was a weapon of mass destruction in the hands of the unscrupulous. And unscrupulous the bishops certainly were. Between AD 325 and about AD 450, it's been calculated, and it's almost impossible to believe, between AD 325 and about AD 450, it's been calculated that 30,000 Christians were killed by other Christians. Anyone not signing up to the official party line was now a heretic. The mid-4th century writer Ammianus Marcellinus wrote that now a bishop would use threats, quotes, to force his subjects to bow down to the God that he himself wished. Presented not with the example of Jesus, but with a list of supposedly theological statements, the church simply splintered. Mark Edward, who's professor of early Christian studies at Oxford, says there were now as many heresies as there were bishops. In fact, you might even say there were as many heresies as there were Christians. Let me just show you just another little inscription we have here. If I can find it, here we go. Here we are. Share. There we are. The church split into what? Arians, Cataphrygians, Manichaeans, Meletians, Paulinians, Pelagians, Photinians, Sabellians, and goodness knows only, well, Elsians. It's an extraordinary sight.
Anyway, by the end of the 4th century, there were marauding gangs of monks or other church employees such as stretcher bearers, pallbearers, and grave diggers who were beating people up and killing them. In AD 390, the emperor Theodosius was the first of many emperors to have to ban the monks from cities because they'd become so violent. And the so-called heretics, many of them were themselves bishops and monks who were mutilated. In Alexandria, Pope Theophilus,
that would be Saint Theophilus,
of course, they all were, strangled a monk with his own hands. In fact, over 3,000 Christians were massacred on one day in the Alexandrian church of Acacius. Well, this church-led violence in these decades was unique in scale in the already quite violent history of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, in the entire history of the Roman Empire, there was nothing like it. Now, the point about all of this is this extraordinary corruption, this extraordinary collection of wealth, and this amazing outburst of violence, is that this was the context in which the church we now have emerged. Look, the vestments that priests wear are based on the imperial robes of the 4th to the 8th century. In the 1950s, the Jesuit historian Joseph Jungmann established that our present liturgies were pretty much formed in the 4th and 5th centuries, including that list of recent martyrs and made-up names in the so-called Roman canon, Linus, Cletus, Sextus, Clement, and the rest. And that's just another example of a fake succession. We could talk more about that if you like. It was now that the church shifted from the Greek that everyone spoke, even in Rome, to Latin, which was only understood by the rich. It was now that the books of the current New Testament were selected and then translated from the original Greek that everybody knew into Latin, which only the rich did.
And it's interesting that this slimming down or this creating of what we know as the New Testament and the move to Latin were initiated by a pope called Damasus.
Oh, that's Saint Damasus.
Yeah. Yes. Now, this is really well known for the fact that during his election in AD 366, he had 137 of his rival supporters murdered inside one of Rome's churches. In fact, the violence was so bad, the prefect in charge of the city had to flee for his life. And it was at this point that the Emperor Julian noted angrily, "Even wild beasts are less savage to men than Christians are to each other. We're not making this up. The church now started building extravagantly decorated basilicas, but with elaborate sections cordoned off for the clergy and the remainder of the space for the rich. On the walls, Christ was no longer the young shepherd with a lost sheep on his shoulder. He was now Christ's Pantocrator, an image of power, modelled exactly on images of the secular emperors.
Well, no surprise, the poor went off to develop their own version of Christianity. They did what they'd always done, visiting their dead in the graveyards around the towns, as indeed they still do in Mexico and some places in Eastern Europe. In Rome and elsewhere, many of those graves were in underground passages and had rooms decorated with feasts. We talk much more about the catacombs in our podcast. You should read Ramsay MacMullen on what he calls the second church, the church of the poor. Most of the feasting at the graveyards was in fact done above ground. Some graves even had a tube down which you could send a shot of your deceased ancestors' favourite tipple. I hope they
Sounds a good idea.
Picks that up for me when Anyway, all this didn't pass unnoticed in the smart new posh basilicas in the town centre, the ones for the rich. From the middle of the 4th century, therefore, the bishops began discovering the bones of martyrs, often those killed in the persecutions at the beginning of the century.
You see, they had dreams about where to find these bones, and then they disinterred them and brought them into their basilicas. And there was one, Ambrose, Bishop of Milan.
Saint Ambrose.
Yeah, he was the most notorious of all the relic collectors. He encouraged the Christian poor to come inside to visit his newly discovered holy dead in his vast new hall that he'd built.
Yeah, and he called it the Ambrosiana. Humble man, Ambrose.
He wanted them in his building rather than to be outside feasting in the city cemetery. And I mean, if the poor wanted bones or, for example, candles, which was a pagan custom, well, Ambrose could provide them both.
Yeah, no doubt at a price. Yeah.
And hence a whole new trade we still have in martyrs, relics, and candles.
What had happened here was that the church had simply vanished into secular Roman society. The church did not convert the Roman Empire. It was merged with it. Its government became part of secular government. Its congregations forgot all about Paul's ideals of equality and simply fell into line with the gender and class conventions of secular society.
Yeah, it took the iconography and the language of the rich. It adopted the graveyard rituals of pagan society. It even adopted its fairy tales, which is why in the 4th century, dragons start appearing in saints' lives. The story began to be told that Pope Sylvester...
That's Saint Sylvester? He was the Pope actually at the time of Nicaea.
Well, that he defeated a dragon right in the streets of Rome.
Much more serious, the church simply turned its back on the spirit and worshipped the gods of power and money. Ammianus Marcellinus, the non-Christian commentator we've already seen, noted sadly that out in the rural communities, the churches were still led by humble folk who were doing their best to set an example of faith and charity. But in the big cities, the church had taken over. And as it descended headlong into money and worldliness, the church desperately began to invent myths of past persecutions and successions from the apostles and the fairy tale of Peter going to Rome. If it was authority you wanted, then ancient society agreed that you needed to prove your pedigree, and the mythical successions of Peter and the apostles was the best that the church could come up with.
So the historical truth is that many of the early saints we celebrate in feast days through the year either didn't exist or were like modern gangsters. They saw that the church now offered an unrivaled opportunity for wealth and power, and they lied, stole, and committed murder to get their share. There was nothing apostolic about the church they established.
Yeah, the apostolic church is and always has been wherever the Spirit moves and wherever people love God and their neighbour. The Jesus of the Gospels, as we saw, has no time for status and authority. For him, the kingdom is where the humble perceive the Spirit. It's where the hungry are fed and the naked clothed. Authority is not conferred, but earned. Jesus had a simple rule of thumb. By their fruits we shall know them.
That's it. Sorry, it's taken us longer, but I can say that you can find out more from our podcast, History Cafe. You'll find it on most podcast platforms. There are 6 episodes in a series called The Real Life Magisterium. Oh, he's found the wrong thing. The Secret History of the Roman Catholic Church. But anyway, don't worry about that. historycafe.org. You can see photos and you can see all our sources there. And I think we should stop. Oh, there's
No, you can't see it, so it's fine. Don't worry. We've lost our third inscription, but no,
anyway, sorry. Anyway, there we are. And sorry it took longer than I'm sure Cor were expecting.
Well, whilst Mary Varley is finding her unmute button, I just want to say that was mind-blowing. Mary Varley, is it over to you, my love? How are we going to manage the questions?
Well, Mary, I think if you're happy to do that, you're there, you go ahead.
Well, terrific. Can I just repeat what we said right at the beginning? You may not have heard us or may not have joined. In your, oh goodness me, we're getting clouds of appreciation going up and down. Isn't that wonderful?
Very kind of you.
Yeah, oh my, it's like a fireworks. In your buttons, you should have a little heart which says react, or you might have a little hand which says raise hand. So please do, if you've got any questions after that astounding presentation, please do put up your yellow hand and you will move, I hope, to the head of the queue for anything that you would like to ask John. And Penelope, I can't get over the number of applauses that you guys are getting.
I think it's just everyone's just discovered how to do it.
Yeah, we've all found our buttons.
Yeah, as John says, they're so pleased we've come to an end. I'm sorry.
But you know, this is because you've crossed the I, you've dotted the I's, you've crossed the T's, you've joined the dots. We always wondered. We just wondered how we went from the teachings of Jesus to the church that we've got now.
Yeah, we wondered too. In fact, we began on this because we were. I think I said to John, "Oh, the world's in such a terrible state, you know, with climate change, etc. Can we look at another time when an empire came to the end?" And so we're looking at the end of the Roman Empire, and we found out about the climate change, etc. But that wasn't really going to make a series. And then John just kept finding out what he kept hearing about this 4th century church. And that you know, we weren't even looking for it, really.
I think, I mean, you've heard me say it before, Mary, that I thought for some time, maybe as a historian I would, but that we should move from theology to history. The theologians, we love the theologians, but the point is that the Catholic Vatican theologians can say what they like. They can, I won't say they can make it up, they can say what they like. But history is very difficult to deny. We should look at actually what the church has done, not only in the 4th century, but you know, the Medicis, the Borgias, all the rest of it. We should look at what the church has actually done. The church actually, by their fruits you shall know them. We need to look at what the church actually does. And once you take that back to the original part of the church, if you move from theology to history, yes, absolutely, what you discover is truly, truly shocking. Truly shocking. I'm astonished. Ramsay MacMullen, the Yale historian, who talks about the 30,000 who were killed, he says, you know, this is taking us a while to comprehend this extraordinary outburst in killing, bearing in mind that very few Christians had been killed by pagans before that. So there simply wasn't, there were a few episodes of persecution, but very few, it seemed, had actually been killed by the pagan Roman, by the Roman emperors. But tens of thousands were killed by other Christians in the aftermath of Nicaea, as it all began to be about control over what you said and what you believed.
Wow. I'm going to just move on to the hands up. I saw we had a couple of hands who have disappeared. Do please come back again.
Yeah, I hope we haven't put them.
But for the moment, Joe Bennett, would you like to unmute yourself and ask your question, Joe?
Yes, I'm video's off because I just rolled out of bed. I'm here in Australia. Sounds pretty
Great.
I'm sorry to wake you up, Joe.
No, you didn't wake me up. You talked about the poor church. Now, I'd like to hear more about that, where you said there were sort of 2 divisions, where there was the rich church and the poor church, and the poor kept doing what they were always doing. Could you expand on that, please?
So far as we know from the archaeology, and again, it's Ramsay MacMullen who's really done some good stuff on this. We know from the archaeology what you begin to get from the 4th century onwards are churches which are divided very much. The clergy have more and more and more space in them. You have very exalted pulpits, you have big spaces at the front where the clergy sit. And then you have parts at the back where clearly the rich were sitting. They were clearly designed for the rich to sit in. And the poor, apparently, were left simply to stand outside in the corridors and in the courtyards. It's extraordinary. I mean, up until that point, really, the church met in people's houses, mostly a house church, occasionally buildings set aside for them. We could talk about that if you like, but mostly in people's houses. From the 4th century, with all this money that suddenly they acquired by becoming part of the imperial administration, these basilicas began to be built. And that they were basilicas primarily for the rich. And what we know is that the poor went on doing what they had always done, which is simply going and communing with their dead out in the cemeteries, which are out on the edges of the cities. Interesting, isn't it? Because we always think of the catacombs being a place where Christians hid from persecution. That, in fact, was a myth that grew up in the 4th century. And there's, again,
the 16th century.
It grew up in the 4th century to start with, and then it was interestingly boosted by some archaeology that was done at the end of the 16th century and in the 17th century by a Maltese archaeologist called Bozio in
related
Rome.
to Peter.
Might have been related to Peter, yes, Maltese. But the fact was that's a myth. There are catacombs, and in those catacombs you do discover rooms which have pictures of people hanging feasts, but because that's what the pagans had always done. And it seems that the poor Christians simply went on and just created a kind of Christian version of that, and they went out and had feasts, call them agapes, call them what you like, out in their graveyards. And it was during the 4th century, therefore, that the bishops, realizing that they were preaching only to the rich, and as MacMullen says, you can tell this is what's going on because all those sermons are in Latin. And only the rich spoke Latin. And they're talking about, when you discipline your slaves or when you sell your rings or something, they're clearly talking to the rich. The rich are in the church, the poor are out in the graveyards. And it seems why this whole cult of martyrs and of saints' relics and so on are brought into the churches to attempt to get the poor to come into the churches. We were in a town in south of France.
Money, really.
Yeah, we were in a town in south of France a couple of weeks ago, and we were looking into the eyes of Saint Cecilia.
Yeah, there was her skull.
There was her skull in a glass case. Now, I mean, museums are very squeamish these days about putting human remains on show. But this cathedral is quite happy to put St. Cecilia's skull in a glass case for us all to go and have a look at. Extraordinary. I mean, it's just this extraordinary use of relics, use of bones and so on. Extraordinary thing. And it seems that this was a response to what the poor were doing, like simply staying away from the church. And what the rich tried to do was get them to come back into the church by using these relics and this kind of rather pagan idea of being where the dead were.
John, I hate to tell you, but I was in Rome seeing the skeleton, the bones of Saint Cecilia, which had been carefully brought back from the catacombs by Pascal or...
Did she have a head? Was the skull? Or is there lots of skulls?
There are probably lots of skulls.
No, we have been assured that she was preserved uncorrupted. Most beautiful statue of her. Anyway...
Well, I say we saw not only a head, but also an arm. So maybe she had several arms. 2 heads.
Enough. Mary Varley, you have a question.
Yeah, I do. I wonder how far current theological education ever gets near any of this. Do the people in positions of power actually know this history? I'm not expecting you to have the definitive answer to that.
And not my period, as they say. I mean, I don't think they do. And I think one of the things that's really alarming is that the traditionalist theologians continue to use the church fathers, the writings of the church fathers, as if they were written in last week's newspapers. This stuff shouldn't be used any more than any other ancient stuff should be used to illuminate what we do today. This is very expert stuff. You have to know exactly what you're doing when you're dealing with this stuff. How is it translated? How do we know who wrote it? How do we know when it came from? Most of the time, this is all mysterious. And so we simply should not allow our bishops to start quoting these things at us. And my suspicion is that these guys are simply unaware of this. And as usual, what's happened here is that other historians of the late Roman Empire, have been waking up to all this stuff. And over the last 2 or 3 generations, they've been realizing that they need to rewrite all their late Roman stuff, because they're beginning to come at it with a much more kind of modern perspective. Of course, the church won't catch up with that. It lags behind. It's not in its interest to take any notice of this stuff. And so, we've got to make our voices heard here and say, wake up. We know this stuff really doesn't apply to us in the way you think it does. Please, can we do some modern scholarship on
But
this?
we've got somebody like Tom O'Loughlin.
Tom's great, yeah.
Who absolutely agrees with what we've been saying, because we checked a lot of it out with him.
Yeah. Don't blame Tom. No, it's our.
No, but I mean, he's within the church. He calls himself a presbyter, but I'm sure they're not listening to him in the Vatican either.
No, people like Tom, absolutely. That's absolutely right. He absolutely knows.
He's a threat, isn't he?
Similarly, Alfred Osborne, who I talked to about the apostles. I mean, these guys, they're aware of all this stuff. They know this stuff, but who's listening to them within the church?
I was going to say I would fear for them if. Anyway, let's. Hugh Lee, you've been waiting very patiently with your hand up. Could you you've unmuted? Thank you, Hugh. Your turn.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you for absolutely fascinating historical reconstruction, I suppose, reinterpretation, which was very, very helpful. It reminded me of the Reformation, that what the Reformation wasn't about history, it was about theology, but it was saying very much the same things, it seems to me. And I'm just wondering whether you see those parallels or whether you see it as very different.
I absolutely do see those parallels. I mean, except that I might interpret them differently from you. I mean, take Henry VIII. The reason Henry VIII broke from the Church of Rome was nothing to do with theology. Henry VIII had nothing to do with Protestantism at all. What that had to do with, and we did actually make a series about this, please check it out. I mean, it has to do, in fact, mostly with foreign policy, and also to do with relations of power relations within the realm. It was all politics, and that's all. Nothing to do with theology at all. And that also has got a lot of what's to do with what was going on in Spain against France and the internal politics of Germany. If you look at the various church councils that take place, culminating in Trent, very nearly there isn't a divide between the Protestants and the Catholics. Things are very nearly actually healed, but politics takes over. The extremists take over. The guys who would have tried to find a compromise are simply pushed out. The extremists managed to push the church in that direction. And so we have this Reformation. But it was mostly about politics. And you'd have to say that the reason we have a particularly authoritarian church now is that in the middle of the 19th century, when the church was losing its lands and its temporal authority in Italy, it then withdrew into itself and began to invent these things like papal infallibility. It began to say that it in Rome must dictate to everybody what their liturgies must be. Until that point, people decided for themselves. It became more and more centralized. I mean, what was the first church council that had no laity present? Vatican I. 1870, and that's all politics. It's all about politics. The laity were the previous ones, but they were excluded in Vatican I and they were excluded in Vatican II. So
let's do another series on that.
It's all politics. This is about politics. And the extraordinary, sorry, I'm going to get to other people's, but the extraordinary thing is that people like Joseph Ratzinger wrote stuff saying the church is not subject, it's not contingent on history. It simply does its own thing and the world doesn't affect it. Well, I'm sorry, but nothing could be further from the truth. All the way through, the church is simply responding to the politics of the moment.
Thank you, Hugh. I must move us on swiftly because we've 2 or 3 people waiting. Father Don Pachuta, could you unmute yourself? Father Don, you've vanished. Let's hope you're being pinned. But perhaps we'll move on to Michael Weston and maybe we can find Father Don in a minute. Michael, unmute yourself and the floor is yours for your question. That's it, Michael.
Thank you. Fascinating. And intuitively, I subscribe to everything that you say. But what is it that keeps you fighting for this church? You so obviously, why do you not leave to go to a non-Episcopal church? What is it in our tradition which holds you there?
I think the answer is can I say? I remember a friend of mine when I was at college who converted and tried all the different churches in the town. He went to, the Anglican
Converted to
ones.
what?
So he became a Christian, and he went to the Anglican ones. He went to the Catholic ones, and in the end, he went up to the Eastern Orthodox Church, and there was a bishop there called Callistos Ware, Timothy Ware, and Timothy Ware said to him, "You must go where you can pray." And it was as simple as that. And I remember Patrick, my friend, coming back and saying, "I must go where I feel I can pray in this place." And in fact, he became an Orthodox member of the Orthodox Church. I think he still is. And I think maybe that's in our case too. I personally grew up a Methodist in a non-Episcopal tradition, which is maybe some of that you're getting coming through here. But I became a Catholic when I was 29. But I went there because I could pray. And the thing is, I think that that's still true. We go along to a Catholic church near where we live, and we go because that's where we can pray. And I think the point is, though, that we go because we can pray with the people who are there. We have a lovely priest.
But
we
also,
feel we
we
can
don't
pray
go
with
to
him.
the nearest one.
No, we don't.
So
but we don't go because we feel we should, or because we have to. We go because. So I personally feel that that's where we're at. We go where we can pray, and that may be in the Catholic Church. It may be elsewhere.
So it's a very deep spirituality, really, isn't it?
Interesting you should say that. I mean, yes. I mean, I suppose if I spoke personally, one of the things that converted me was Elgar's Dream of Gerontius. And that's a very profound kind of experience. And so there is something very profound about that. And the Catholic Church can be, on its day, have a wonderfully profound spirituality. That's exactly right.
I'm a convert of 11 years, and it was Newman's story which helped me on the way.
Yeah.
But then one understands that what he was looking for was the early church, the original church.
Yeah, absolutely. Newman's quite interesting on history. I mean, that's another discussion, but yeah, absolutely.
But thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you.
Terrific
Thank you,
presentation.
Michael. Beautiful question. Kevin Liston, all the way to Australia. Over to you, please.
Hi, Kevin.
Hi, Kevin. See.
Thank you, Penelope and John. It's a wonderful tour de force, really, and it fills in a huge number of gaps that we have all felt for a very long time. But described as very much a history of power and control, of a ruthless, almost dedicated takeover of everything possible. Such things have a limited life, and all kinds of empires and tyrannical regimes don't last, they fail. So how do you account for the survival of Christianity and the Catholic Church over 2,000 years?
Yeah,
still showing no signs of actually dying.
Yeah, it's a very, very interesting question. I think that's in fact two questions. How do we account for the survival of Christianity is different from the survival of the church.
Yes,
the survival of Christianity, I think, doesn't require us to give any. There's no wonder about that. I mean, the Spirit blows where it wills, and I feel that within the church at any one time there have always been people who have listened to the Spirit and have moved with the Spirit. So my feeling is that it doesn't, the survival of the Christianity, of the faith, doesn't take much explaining. That's my feeling. Why does the Catholic Church survive? The Catholic Church survives like any other church because it's useful to the people in power. It's useful to the people in power. Look at the up until the Reformation. Look at any of the look around the cabinet, the council table of any monarch of England. Who do you see? Cardinals, bishops. They're all the diplomats. They're all the chancellors. William of Wykeham, Bishop of Winchester, the Chancellor to Richard II, all these kind of people. It's useful to them because they have education. You don't have to pay them. They have authority. They have pulpits. After the Reformation, the church begins to be, the church in England begins to be the organized national space for poor relief. The vestry begins to be one of the local governmental kind of organs. Churches are very useful to people in power. And it seems to me that that's one of the reasons why churches survive, is because they're useful to people in power. Of course, the other reason is that the Catholic Church became enormously wealthy. It became a power in its own right. It, of course, as you know, had lands across the whole of the middle of Italy, which it kept until the middle of the 19th century. It was a temporal power. And one of the really interesting things, it seems to me, that's happening now and has happened since the middle of the 19th century is that without that temporal power, the Roman Catholic Church is finding it harder and harder and harder to persuade people that it's actually relevant, that actually matters anymore. You know, without being a kind of diplomatic presence in Europe and indeed around the world, how does Pope Leo persuade people to listen to his voice? It's getting harder and harder and harder. And simply to say, oh, well, I'm the successor of St. Peter, won't do anymore. Not only is it not historical, but people aren't really interested in that anymore. The only way Pope Leo can persuade people to listen to his voice is by saying things that are worth hearing. And it's the first time that that's been the situation, you know, that actually they no longer have a purchase on enough people in enough places that really matter to be able to command attention on the world stage. It's all very well saying that on a Sunday morning, there are more people in church in Nigeria than there are in the whole of Europe, which is statistically supposed to be true. That doesn't give you worldly power. That doesn't mean anybody's got to listen to you. You need followers where they matter. Well, they have some in a lot of very wealthy parishes in North America. Is that enough? We'll see. But what I'm trying to say, I think, is that the reason that the churches survive, they survive for all kinds of political reasons. The reason the faith survive, of course, is because the Spirit of Christ is with us.
Thanks, John.
Thank you, Kevin. Lovely to see you.
Great to see you again.
I'm just going to say that it is 9:20, and we're usually very strict about finishing at 9:30. But I can see we have 4 questions left. We would still like to briefly give our notices before we finish. And so I think we must take these questions, please, the remaining 3 questions, because it's just been so fascinating that we really can't do without them. So Richard Brooke, would you like to unmute and... Oh, sorry, Father Don, you were in the queue. Sorry, Father Don, you were in the queue. Could you jump, Richard, if you don't mind waiting, Richard, a minute. Father Don, your question.
So thank you for this fascinating presentation. I'm an ally. I've been writing about what you've been talking about for several decades. I write 15,000 words a week on the readings for that week. I have 2 concerns, some of the questions that have appeared in the chat. Number one, the head of the Nazi propaganda said that he studied the Vatican to figure out how he was going to do Nazi Germany propaganda. And the question is, people have been asking, how did this happen? It's called brainwashing. It's imbued in people and it's sticking and it's false information. So I'd like to hear your comment about brainwashing. Number 2, translation is everything. A late Episcopal Bishop, John Sanford, and a Jungian theologian he was, called it linguistic barbarism. So, for example, there are no Jews in the Bible. The word Jew didn't come into English till the 12th century. Yet, the anti-Semitic king and popes stuck it in, and it's not being taken out. And of course, a child hears in church, the disciples were locked behind closed doors because of the Jews. Well, there's anti-Semitism. I call it systemic Catholic Christian anti-Semitism. So I'd like to hear comments about brainwashing and about revising the Bible correctly in translation. I'm trying to get a book together.
Just quickly.
Well, the 2 are completely related. I mean, take gender in the Bible. I mean, you'll know that, of course, you know, in the Greek, the word for people, you know, it is used often. So Jesus doesn't say, I will make you fishers of men. He says, I'll make you fishers of people. That's what he actually says. And what's really interesting is that when you look at what happened in the 4th century, Jerome, who is Saint Jerome, who's another fairly dodgy character when you get close to him, but Jerome, who started, at least he looked at some of the Gospels, other people translated most of it into the Vulgate. But when they translated the Gospels, they translated that word fishers of men into fishers of people. They used the Latin word for people. So where did the men thing come from? Well, the men thing came from the fact that up until the 1950s, men meant people, that's fair enough. I mean, well, perhaps, maybe it was understood in that kind of a way. It no longer does, and it hasn't done for many decades. So the ESV, which unfortunately we have to use in Britain now,
which has just come out,
goes on translating this as fishers of men, and it does the same thing all over the place. And it's, as you say, it's barbarous. It doesn't, the original Greek doesn't say that. The Vulgate doesn't say that. Nothing else says that. And this is a form of brainwashing that's going on, I'm afraid. That is a form of brainwashing. We're just not told this stuff. We're not told that it's not there in the Gospels. And we should be told this stuff.
I do think that the brainwashing comes also from the sort of notes we were given at the beginning of the synod, which were, and it will be your duty to respond to these questions, and it'll be the bishop's duty to discern. Well, so people read that and thought, oh, okay, that's what the bishops meant for. I mean, where did that come from?
Yeah, I'm afraid the synodal process, as it was conducted in Britain, was very largely a process of brainwashing. I mean, that kind of way. We were told what we were allowed to say, where we were allowed to say it, and in what context we were allowed to say it, and basically what sort of conclusions we were supposed to come to. I mean, really shocking. Anybody who's been part of a corporation recognized right from the very first moment what it was. It was just a corporate exercise in appearing to consult the workforce. Actually, it got a bit out of hand and people began to do much better things, but that's what sadly is going on.
We need to know what you write for, Father Don.
Okay.
Sometimes
I write to an email list of 400 people in the United States and Europe.
Wow.
Perhaps we could join it.
King James is so bad that they translate words like whoever or one who as a man who.
Yeah, terrible. Perhaps you can let Mary and the
we'll be in touch, Father Don.
Yeah, please do.
Wonderful to meet you.
Yeah, Richard was talking.
Thank you so much. I'm going to skate rapidly on to Richard Brooke. If you could unmute Richard. Thank you for your patience. Here comes Richard.
Right on it. Yes, I have. Thank you. I want to pick up something similar to what I think Michael Weston and Kevin Lister were saying about how, if you like, the gospel has survived. I mean, it seems to me that John and Penelope have sketched out a very eloquent picture of everything that's been wrong with the institutional church, and it's historical picture. What I would like to see, I mean, I'm not saying necessarily by you, but do we not need a history of how the gospel has survived? Now, it's simple to say, yes, it's the Spirit, which is true. And that's why I'm still bother with Christianity at all. But it seems to me that alongside the history of everything that's wrong with the institutional church, there must be a history of how Christians, here, there, everywhere, however it was done, kept the gospel going. After all, that's what apostles are, isn't it? They are people who are sent out, and some people have felt themselves to be sent out and spread the gospel. I would like to know their history, as in the context of everything else that's been wrong. But that what's been wrong is not the whole story, not the whole history.
Absolutely, and it wouldn't it be great if somebody could try to piece. It would be a very difficult story to write. Because you start having to ask that question, what is right in any one period? And that's quite difficult to determine because, of course, historically, things change in every period. So what exactly can you say is, what is the heart of Christianity in the 14th century? What's the heart of Christianity in the 12th century? What's the heart of Christianity in the 17th century? This thing is a pretty moving target. And I don't think that's any accident because it seems to me the Spirit blows where it will. It's not possible to follow one line through all the way through because that isn't at all what Jesus was talking about. He says the Spirit will be wherever the Spirit will be. And it seems to me that this is something that is going to be very difficult ever to piece together. If you were going to try and locate the people, or I mean, it would also be an exercise in your judgment, my judgment, one's judgment, to say these people were true Christians and those people weren't, and that would be extremely difficult to do. What
I think that's making a sort of call that may not need to be made. It seems to me there are continuities. One of which is the idea that that love of God and love of your neighbour are really what it's all about has persisted. There has been a continuity. I mean, ever since Judaic times, via the Christian revelation, and that has been carried on. Now, so I can see, it may be that the sort of standard historical evidence is difficult to find, but even if it is difficult, it seems to me that is precisely why it's worth bothering with Christian faith now, over against all the terrible things that you've described that have gone wrong with the institutional church.
Yeah, if you're saying that at any one time within the church there are those people who understood what Jesus had said, that there are basically love your God and love your neighbor as yourself, there are people who've done that, then I think that's, of course, absolutely right. There have been people who do that. Interestingly, we had earlier conversations with a wonderful Carolyn nun, Kochu Abraham, who talks about the third space where people who are not part of the institution, not part of the kind of conforming part of it, but people who are willing to do what the Spirit leads them to do. And they're a kind of third space that has always been within the church. So I think absolutely, of course, that's right. There have always been people who've spotted that and have kept going. Maybe the good thing is that we shall never be able to write their history. It's difficult to pin down. I think we've got one more person. We ought to.
Yeah, I think Richard, we must say thank you so much. It's time to turn to Brenda, and Brenda, if you could keep it brief, that would be extremely kind.
Okay, my name is Reverend Dr. Joanna Trolson. I'm a guest of Brenda. We're in Northern California, in the Bay Area. I'm a Roman Catholic woman priest. Yeah. So when you say, has the Spirit called us? It certainly has. I have a community called Namaste Inclusive Catholic Community. I have been the leader there for 14 years. And right now we are reading Ilia Delio's work.
Yeah.
And Ilia and Thierry de Chardin, Jung, we are very progressive. We are following the Spirit. There is a way to move forward. I had to leave the church for a while to come back in a new way, and it's happening. So don't lose faith. It's my dear friend Brenda who brought me here, and I am very grateful. Thank you very much. It was excellent.
Well, thank you. What a wonderful witness. And my view is, as we tried to say, Jesus would say, by their fruits you shall know them. The church has no business saying you can't be a priest, you can't be a bishop. If by your fruits you do those things that are Christ-like, it seems to me the church has nothing whatever it can say about that. That is Jesus' view. By their fruits you shall know them. The point was the tenants did not own the vineyard. The tenants did not own the vineyard,
Thank you so much, Brenda.
Spotted the Spirit.
Thank you, Brenda. Thank you,
Joanna.
All questions, Diana. I must ask Mary Varley to unmute herself and take over from me to thank John and Penelope. I don't know how you're going to find the words, but good luck.
Don't bother.
Well, the first thing I'm going to say is that I paid €22 to see those bones, and I'm going to write and ask for my money back. I don't
saw you coming.
I don't need to do anything very much, because this is what everybody else has been saying. They've been saying, write a book. Powerful, brilliant, revealing, extraordinary, mind-blowing, fascinating, a wonderful start to my Friday. So that says it all.
Thank you.
We have found it riveting. I do not want you to leave. I want you to come back and carry on and carry on. But you've got to go to bed, and some of us have got to go to work. So I thought I'd just leave with something that someone put in the chat that moved me too. And she asked, what's the next loving step? And I thought, following on from what you said, that's a great question. So mega, mega, mega thanks to both of you.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting us.
Hi, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Over to Rhiannon.
It's my pleasure to announce some of our upcoming events. I think we've got some slides to help me. Excellent. Thanks, Kevin. Right. Well, we're excited to tell you about our upcoming discussions that'll take us to the year's end. And we'll look forward so much to your company on, first of all, the 20th of November, filmmaker John Mutz, who's former LA Los Angeles police captain, and now he's a member of the Immaculate Heart community. And he's going to show and discuss his short, extraordinary, and believe me, very, very poignant film, Not Worth Killing. And it tells the story, as you may know, of Mitchell Rutledge, who was convicted for killing and was on death row, and his transformation and of the immense impact and influence one person, in this case, Sister Lillian Oliver, also of the Immaculate Heart community, and inspired in her case, inspired by those beautiful words from Isaiah. I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palm of my hand, says the Lord. Inspiration for her and the influence that one person, in this case her, can have on another's life. So we do look forward to your company on the 20th of November. And the next slide, please. And as if that weren't enough for the rest of the year, 4th of December, our good friend Dermot Omer, who's a member of the Sacred Heart Missionary Order, social psychologist, I'm sure known to all of you, and a writer. And he's spoken to Root and Branch and also to Spirit Unbounded. And his interests focus on the work of Teilhard de Chardin, Ilia Delio mentioned just now, I think, by Joanna. So thank you for that, Joanna. And he's going to be discussing reworking the tradition from the standpoint of the revelation of the divine in Christ, and setting this in the context of human and planetary evolution. So again, we'll look forward to your company as we approach Christmas on the 4th of December. And almost finally, History Cafe. A quick recall. So Mary Varley and John and Penelope have told us a little bit about the History Cafe. It is a treasure trove of podcasts, including, as we've heard, and so far, several podcasts on the theme that we've been listening to. This resource brings history, our history, to life and into the light. Do explore all that this site has to offer. It's quick and easy to register for updates and also to locate podcasts, and it does use other platforms as well. And there are such helpful descriptions that accompany each podcast. And in Penelope and John's own words, the works of other historians are approached, and this is so important, with an open mind, and they immerse themselves in the complexities of each period. You know, for the curious, the inquirer, the explorer, I can't recommend History Cafe enough. Thank you. And now, finally, over to you, please. We'll be sending you, I think tomorrow, possibly, some short quotes from this talk. And if you're able to, please consider sharing any you choose to on your social media platforms if you use them. Today's talk, charting the history, the shocking history of the 4th century church, the foundation of today's church, is surely a call to action for a wider conversation. So look out for your MailChimp tomorrow. And now to Angela for a prayer to bring this discussion to a close for now. Thanks, Angela.
To Alison.
Alison, I apologise. Hi, Alison. Thank you.
Dear Spirit, we thank you for the powerful witness that John and Penelope have offered this evening. We are inspired by the new understandings they have shared. We pray that they will continue to bear witness to truth and to the real inheritance of Jesus' kingdom. We give thanks for the many, many others who also challenge, in small everyday ways, that which they see does not seem to be of God. Thanks for those who speak out against power abuse and misuse of authority in the church at great cost to themselves. For these and everyone in Root and Branch, we pray that you will give us the strength to persevere in creating a movement that reflects God's kingdom. Amen.